And we have not learned how to live unless we have learned to properly relate to our environment. Environment, everything that surrounds us, everything we touch, everything we see, everything we notice. This is number 4 in a series of 12 laws for great living. And this is learn to use things, what's around us. There's a good text in 1 Timothy 6:17. It says, God has given us richly all things to enjoy. God is good, and he has given us things to enjoy. But the problem comes when we're not enjoying the things, when we're not using the things, but the things start to use us. Then there's trouble. It is very easy to slip across the line, and instead of being one who uses things, the things start using us. So it was, we find in the book of Joshua, chapter 7, with this fellow who's named Achan. They had just had a marvelous victory, taking the city of Jericho. And Jericho was a wealthy city because it was on the caravan route. And of course, it was not just the ordinary things in Jericho, but Achan's eyes were observant, and he saw a beautiful Babylonish garment. And he saw in the city some silver coins and a wedge of gold. And he couldn't get those items out of his head. They just got stuck there. In other words, he was coveting them. And so not only was his wrongful desire, because they were told they could not loot the city for personal gain. Everything in it was to belong to the Lord. But Achan forgot that. And he took the silver, he took the gold, he took the beautiful coat from Babylon and hid them under the floor of his tent. As a result, Israel lost the next battle at the city of Ai, and as a result, Achan was punished and his family, and they were all put to death. How did all this start? He got swept away by stuff, things so easy. Instead of enjoying them, he coveted them and broke the rules. But then you go to the book of Genesis, the 25th chapter. You have something else. You have twin brothers, Esau and Jacob. And even though they were twins born at almost the same time, Esau was the first to make his appearance. And so he was the eldest of the two, the older of the two. And he had a birthright, which in that culture and that time was very important. Just about everything went with the birthright. Now in our culture, it doesn't mean that much. But then it really did. Well, he'd been out hunting, and Jacob was sort of a homebody, and he was home cooking up some stew. And when Esau came back, weary from the trip of the hunting, and hungry, was he hungry. And he smelled this stew that Jacob was brewing up and wanted it. And Jacob was sharp. He said, yes, you can have some. if you give me your birthright for it. Ah. Esau just could not resist, and so he sold his valuable, treasured birthright for a bowl of soup. So it is today. Girls have lost their virginity for a few dollars, or maybe even less. Fellows have lost their honor for just a few moments of fun and gaining some things. You have to learn how to use things. And the danger is that we become obsessed with things. We know, and you know, that Adam and Eve were created by God and placed in the Garden of Eden, which was a paradise. Paradise? Would you call it a paradise? There was no TV. There was no shopping mall. There was no transportation. All the stuff that we have become bound to and accustomed to just did not exist, but it was paradise. Why was it paradise? Because they had each other and they walked and lived in the presence of God. That's why it was paradise. It is easy to accumulate stuff. My wife Ruth and I were married for close to 65 years. We moved twice only. Many people move a lot, but only twice during those 65 years. We started out as a married couple living in the Chicago suburb of Worth. In 1959, we moved to Chicago in the southeast corner of the city. Now, we knew a year before we moved, we were going to move. And so we started looking around at what we had and getting rid of some things. Why move them if you didn't want them anymore? Moving's hard work. And for some reason, we moved a curtain stretcher. You say, whatever is a curtain stretcher? Well, back in 1959, you used it to, after you laundered curtains, to stretch them on this wooden frame. We didn't want it, we didn't need it, but we moved it somehow. Then later, we moved again from Chicago to Orland Park, a suburb of the city of Chicago. And we knew a full year before we moved that we were going to move. And during that year, we were being lazy. We were de-accumulating, getting rid of stuff, throwing it away, giving it away if we found somebody who wanted it. And still, at the end of that year, we moved some things that should have been thrown away. It is easy to accumulate. People give us stuff. We think there's something we need. When we moved the second time, our kids had been raised, all 8 of them. And consequently, we had accumulated some things that we no longer had any use for. Instead of perfecting the art of accumulating, work on the skill of deaccumulating, and life will be much better. The more you have, the less enjoyment you have. The more you have, the less enjoyment you have. A greenhouse full of blooming roses. You say, well, it's a lot of roses. But wait, one lone rose in a vase sitting on your table can be admired and enjoyed more than the whole greenhouse full. For the less you have, the more you enjoy it. So that is, yes, of anything. The less you have, the more you'll enjoy. And God, remember, 1 Timothy 6:17, has given us all things to enjoy. But be sure that you are using things and they're not using you. And the more you have, the more time you spend taking care of it. If you have 2 cars, you spend double the time washing them or taking them to be washed. If you have 1, you see, you have cut the time in half, and life is more enjoyable. That's the way it works. Have you thought of perhaps getting rid of some things that you really don't need? For the more you have, the more you have to worry about, and the more you have to take care of. There was a young fellow who told me, he said, I'm a clothes horse. You should see my closet. He says, it's full of jackets that I like. Oh my. But the amazing thing was, he never looked well dressed. But he had all these clothes. Had he fewer clothes, perhaps he could have been better dressed. Perhaps you have a lot of clothes. Had the thought ever entered your mind to just buy no clothes for a whole year? Just use what you have. You have plenty. Learn to get along without some things. Had you ever thought of disciplining yourself? The price of groceries has gone up, and up again. Have you ever thought of eating no meat for 30 days? You'll live through it, yes. It's possible. I love chocolate, and it was years ago when I decided, just as a matter of self-discipline, that I would eat nothing chocolate for an entire month. Well, being a pastor, that presented a problem because there were dinners at church and socials, and the ladies would bake fudge and chocolate cakes, and I would be saying no, and feelings would be hurt, and they'd think I didn't like what they had baked. So I felt the easiest way out of that jam was just to announce that I was not eating chocolate for a month. And so everybody knew it and respected my discipline, personal discipline, and so on. But it was a big mistake, because at the end of the month, chocolate cakes arrived at our house, candy bars, and I saw more chocolate than I had seen in a lifetime. So, but there's hardly out of it. Uh, Deprive yourself. It's good self-discipline of something. Francis of Sales, a godly, holy man who lived in the 16th century, said, deprive yourself frequently of some part of your property. Is there anything you just can't afford to let go? That's the signal. It has become an idol to you. It has become something bigger than you. You're not controlling it. It controls you. After all, it's the simple things of life that work. Grace Noel Crowell has left us many poems. And this one is titled, I have found such joy. I have found, says Grace Crowell, I have found such joy in simple things. A plain, clean room, a nut-brown loaf of bread, a cup of milk, a kettle as it sings, the shelter of a roof above my head, and in a leaf-lace square, along the floor where yellow sunlight glimmers through the door. I have found such joy, she writes, in things that fill my quiet days, a curtain's blowing grace, a potted plant upon my windowsill, a rose fresh cut and placed within a vase, a table cleared, a lamp beside a chair, and a book I long have loved beside me there. Oh my, she had found a secret that maybe could help all of us. Just concentrate on the simple things of life and see how God will begin to bless you. Major on the God-given rather than on the man-made. And then lift your heart in praise to God. In other words, love and be thankful for the natural rather than the artificial. A bowl of soup or a cup of milk rather than a pretzel and a Pepsi. A picnic rather than a movie. Walking rather than riding. Real flowers rather than plastic ones, and so on. A bear in the woods rather than a bear in a cage at the zoo. It was when our kids were growing up. We did a lot of camping. 2 reasons: it was an inexpensive vacation, and also our kids being raised in the city of Chicago, I felt that they just needed to get a break at vacation time, get away from the noise and commotion and dust and dirt of the city, and get out in a natural place and enjoy what God has given. A smogless sky at night when the stars were bright. The greenery of a forest. Just the natural world, which was somehow lost in the artificiality of the city. Well, this year we were going camping this particular year in Minnesota. The best camping was in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario in Canada. And so we're up in northern Minnesota in a state forest and camping at a site between two lakes. When we checked in at the office, the ranger told us, he said, there are bears that have been roaming in the campground, just so you know. Well, we'd come all that way to camp and I wasn't turning around and going back. So bears or no bears, we pitched our tent. Well, while setting up, we saw several bears come roaming back in the woods not far from us. Well, that night when we settled down, the kids in the tents and my wife and myself in another tent, and our son Dan, in his teens at the time, decided he wanted to sleep on the picnic table. So he had his sleeping bag and he was unrolling it on the picnic table. And I said, Dan, I said, if one of those bears comes through, don't you dare move. Just keep still. Well, we had scarce bedded down, and at a campsite not too far away, I heard a garbage can tip over. And I thought, aha, those bears are hungry. The ranger had told us they'd had a dry spring, and the berries didn't come on, and the bears were hungry and looking for anything they could find. So I heard the garbage can go, and then another one closer, and another. One campsite after another. And sure enough, we were next in line, and comes this huge bear prowling. He circled the picnic table on which our son was in the sleeping bag. I'm watching this, having pulled back the flap on our tent, not that far away, very close at our campsite. And then the bear moved on to the next campsite. I tell you, an experience of a lifetime that neither I nor the kids will ever forget. Seeing bears on the loose, near at hand. It beats going to any zoo in the world, yeah. And they did not bother us. We did not bother them, of course, and they did not bother us. But a bear in the woods is sure better experiencing than a bear in the zoo. How do you enjoy things? Do you recognize what God has given? Are you thankful? Have you learned to follow this fourth law out of these 12 laws for great living? Learn to use things. We had a brother who attended our church. He lived in Mokina, the Chicago suburb. And when I visited him after he started attending, I noticed something. He lived in the middle of the block, and the street to the north of his house went up a hill. The street to the south of his house went up a hill, and he was in the bottom of this place. And sure enough, I thought I would never have bought a house located at the bottom of two declines. Well, one night it just poured and poured and poured, and the storm sewers could not carry it off. And they backed up, and soon there was water in his house. Well, he ordered a big dumpster from some trash company, and it sat in the street in front of his house. The water had gotten onto the lower floor of his house. The poor fellow, he was hauling out this soaked stuff until he filled the dumpster with what? Stuff. Stuff. He didn't replace it. He didn't need it. It's just things that somehow he had accumulated but got rid of all along the line there. Learn to use things. Beware of accumulating. Share what you have, a book, your car, some flowers, your house even. If you are enamored with things, you will never be enthralled with Jesus. It was Clara Williams who wrote the words to a song that appears in some hymn books. Clara Williams wrote this: "All my life long I had panted for a drink from some clear spring that I hope would quench the burning of the thirst I felt within. Feeding on the husks around me till my strength was almost gone, longed my soul for something better, only still to hunger on. Well of water ever springing, bread of life so rich and free, untold wealth that never faileth, my Redeemer is to me. Hallelujah," she writes, "I have found him whom my soul so long has craved. Jesus satisfies my longings. Through his blood I now am saved." If you are enamored with things, you'll never be enthralled with Jesus.
Whatever happens, I'll give thanks to you. Whatever happens, I know your love will see me through. I offer my heart, seen a very